An elderly woman didn't know who Sammy Davis Jr. was. When she found out, her reaction was priceless. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon in November 1963, and Sammy Davis Jr. was walking through the streets of Chicago after a disappointing meeting with a potential venue owner. He'd been trying to book the Civic Opera House for a special benefit concert, but the conversation had gone nowhere. The man had been polite but firm. They weren't interested in hosting that kind of entertainment. Sammy knew what that kind meant, even though the man had been too careful to say it directly. It was the same coded language he'd been hearing his entire career, the polite way some people had of saying they didn't want a black entertainer, no matter how famous or talented, performing in their establishment. He was walking slowly, lost in thought about the meeting, and wondering if he should try a different approach or just find another venue entirely, when he noticed an elderly woman standing at the corner of State Street and Madison. She was probably in her 80s, wearing a worn but clean coat and carrying a small purse clutched tightly in her hands. She kept looking back and forth across the busy intersection, clearly wanting to cross but hesitant about the traffic. The light had changed 3 times while she stood there, and each time she would take a step forward, then step back as cars rushed past. The rain was getting heavier, and Sammy could see that she was getting soaked, standing there on the corner. Without thinking about it, he walked over to her. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said gently. "Would you like some help crossing the street?" The woman looked up at him with eyes that were kind but tired. She had to be at least 85 years old, and up close, Sammy could see that she was struggling with more than just the traffic. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she seemed frail in a way that suggested she didn't get out on her own very often. "Oh, would you?" she asked, her voice soft and grateful. "I'm trying to get to the bus stop over there, but these cars go so fast, and I can't see as well as I used to." "Of course," Sammy replied, offering her his arm. "Take your time. We'll wait for the right moment." As they stood waiting for the light to change again, the woman looked up at him more carefully. "You're very kind, young man," she said. "Not many people would stop to help an old woman like me. Most folks are too busy with their own troubles." "It's no trouble at all," Sammy assured her. "Everyone needs a little help sometimes." When the light turned green, they walked slowly across the street together. Sammy matched his pace to hers, making sure she felt steady and safe. Halfway across, she stumbled slightly on an uneven patch of pavement, and he tightened his grip on her arm to keep her from falling. "Thank you, dear," she said, breathing a little heavily. "These old legs aren't what they used to be." "You're doing fine," Sammy encouraged her. "We're almost there." When they reached the other side of the street, the woman looked around for the bus stop and realized it was still another block away. "Oh my," she said, looking disappointed. "I thought it was right here. I must have gotten confused." Sammy looked at his watch. He had another meeting in an hour, but something about this woman reminded him of his own grandmother, who had passed away a few years earlier. She'd been the same age when she died, the same gentle soul who had always been kind to everyone, despite the hardships life had thrown at her. "Would you like me to walk you to the bus stop?" "Oh, I couldn't ask you to do that," the woman protested. "You've already done so much, and I'm sure you have important places to be." "Nowhere more important than making sure you get where you're going safely," Sammy replied. As they walked slowly down the block, the woman began to talk. She told him her name was Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, and that she was visiting Chicago to see her granddaughter, who was in the hospital having a baby. "It's my first great-grandchild," she explained, her face lighting up despite her obvious fatigue. "I took the train up from Springfield this morning, but I'm not used to the big city. Everything seems so much more complicated than it used to be." "How long has it been since you've been to Chicago?" Sammy asked. "Oh, must be 20 years at least," Mrs. Patterson replied. "My husband used to handle all the traveling. I just stayed home and took care of the house and the children. But he passed away last year, and now I have to figure out how to do these things on my own." Sammy felt a pang of sympathy for her. He could hear the loneliness in her voice, the uncertainty of someone who was learning to navigate the world independently after decades of relying on someone else. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said sincerely. "Thank you, dear. He was a good man. Worked at the railroad for 43 years, never missed a day except when he was sick. We had a good life together. But now," she paused, wiping her eyes with a tissue from her purse. "Now I'm just trying to figure out how to keep going without him." They had reached the bus stop, and Sammy could see that the next bus wouldn't arrive for another 15 minutes, according to the posted schedule. "Would you like to wait inside somewhere until the bus comes?" he asked, noticing a small diner across the street. "You could get out of this rain and maybe have a cup of coffee." Mrs. Patterson looked uncertain. "I don't know if I should. I don't want to miss the bus, and I don't have much money for coffee." "My treat," Sammy said, "and we can sit by the window so you can see when the bus arrives." "You really are too kind," Mrs. Patterson said, but she agreed to go with him. The diner was warm and mostly empty, just a few customers scattered around the small restaurant. Sammy helped Mrs. Patterson to a booth by the window where they could clearly see the bus stop, and he ordered coffee for both of them. As they sat talking, Mrs. Patterson continued to share stories about her life. She told him about her children, her grandchildren, and the small town where she'd lived her entire life. She talked about her husband's work, about the garden she maintained behind their house, and about how different everything seemed now that she was on her own. "You know," she said after they'd been talking for about 10 minutes, "I never did ask what you do for work. You seem like such a nice young man, and you speak so well. Are you a teacher, perhaps?" Sammy smiled. "I'm in entertainment. I sing and dance mostly." "Oh, how wonderful," Mrs. Patterson exclaimed. "I love music. My husband and I used to listen to the radio every evening after dinner. We had our favorite programs, the Jack Benny Show, and that lovely fellow who sang all those beautiful psalms. What was his name? Bing Crosby, that's it. Do you know his music?" "Yes, ma'am, I do," Sammy replied. "He's very talented." "And there was another singer we enjoyed, a colored fellow with the most beautiful voice. He sang with a big band, I think. Such a talented young man. Davis, I think his name was. Something Davis." Sammy nearly choked on his coffee. "Davis?" he asked carefully. "Yes, that's right. Sammy Davis, I believe. Have you heard of him? We saw him on the television once, and he was just remarkable. Such talent. He could sing and dance and even play instruments. My husband said he was one of the most talented entertainers he'd ever seen. And my husband wasn't one to give compliments easily." Sammy was quiet for a moment, deeply moved by her words. Here was this elderly woman, who had no idea who he was, talking about his talent with such genuine admiration and respect. In a world where he often faced discrimination and prejudice, where venue owners refused to book him because of his race, this woman was praising his abilities without any agenda or pretense. "You said your husband liked this Sammy Davis?" he asked. "Oh yes, very much. We both did. You know, my husband grew up in the South, and he wasn't raised to think highly of colored people. But when he saw that young man perform, he said it made him realize how wrong he'd been about a lot of things. He said talent like that didn't come from the color of someone's skin. It came from something much deeper." Mrs. Patterson paused to sip her coffee, then continued. "I'll never forget what he told me after we watched that television show. He said, 'Eleanor, I've been wrong about a lot of things in my life, but I'm not too old to learn. That young man has a gift from God, and anyone who can't see past the color of his skin to appreciate it is a fool.' It was one of the few times I ever heard my husband admit he'd been wrong about anything." Sammy felt tears welling up in his eyes. This woman's words, spoken with such sincerity and warmth, meant more to him than any standing ovation he'd ever received. "Mrs. Patterson," he said gently, "I have something to tell you." "What's that, dear?" "I'm Sammy Davis, Jr." Mrs. Patterson looked at him blankly for a moment, Then her eyes widened as understanding dawned. You're him? You're the Sammy Davis we were talking about? Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Patterson stared at him in amazement, then suddenly started laughing. Not mockingly, but with pure joy and delight. Well, I'll be. Here I've been going on and on about how wonderful you are. And you've been sitting there listening to me the whole time. You must think I'm the silliest old woman in Chicago. Not at all, Sammy replied, wiping his eyes. What you said about your husband, about how seeing me perform changed his mind about some things, that's one of the most beautiful things anyone has ever said about my work. Mrs. Patterson reached across the table and patted his hand. Well, it's true, every word of it. And now that I know who you are, I can tell you something else. You're not just a talented entertainer. You're a good man. The way you stopped to help me, the way you've been so patient and kind, that shows character. Your grandmother raised you right. Sammy had to look away for a moment to compose himself. In less than an hour, this woman had gone from being a stranger on a street corner to giving him one of the most meaningful compliments of his entire career. Can I ask you something, Mrs. Patterson? Of course, dear. When you were talking about my television appearance, you mentioned that your husband wasn't raised to think highly of colored people. Did that ever cause problems between you two? I mean, when he started to change his mind about things. Mrs. Patterson considered the question carefully. You know, it wasn't easy at first. My husband was a stubborn man, set in his ways. But he was also fair-minded when it came down to it. Once he started really listening to your music, really watching you perform, he couldn't deny what he was seeing. And then he started paying attention to other colored performers too. That wonderful Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald and so many others. She paused, looking out the window at the bus stop. I think the hardest part for him wasn't changing his mind about colored folks in general, but admitting he'd been wrong for so long. He was proud, and it hurt his pride to realize he'd been unfair to people based on something as silly as skin color. But you know what he finally said to me? What's that? He said, Eleanor, if being wrong about this means I get to discover talent like Sammy Davis Jr., then maybe being wrong isn't always such a terrible thing. He said learning to appreciate your music had made him a better person. Sammy was quiet for a long moment, overwhelmed by the impact his work had apparently had on people he'd never met. Mrs. Patterson, would you mind if I asked you to do me a favor? Anything, dear. When you get home, would you write down what you just told me about your husband and how he changed his mind and what he said? I'd like to keep those words if you don't mind. Of course I will. But can I ask why? Sammy looked out the window at the gray November afternoon, thinking about the meeting he'd just come from, about all the times he'd been turned away from venues because of his race, about all the battles he'd fought to be recognized as more than just the color of his skin. Because sometimes, when you're fighting to change people's minds about things, you start to wonder if it's worth it. You start to wonder if you're really making any difference at all. But what you told me today, it reminds me why the work matters. It reminds me that even when you can't see it happening, hearts and minds can change. Sometimes one performance, one song, one moment of seeing someone's humanity can plant a seed that grows into something beautiful. Mrs. Patterson smiled and squeezed his hand again. Well then, I'm glad I could remind you. Because what you do is important, and you shouldn't ever doubt that. Through the window, they could see the bus approaching the stop. That's your bus, Sammy said, standing up and helping Mrs. Patterson with her coat. Thank you so much for the coffee and for everything, she said as they walked toward the door. This has been the most wonderful part of my whole trip to Chicago. As they crossed the street back to the bus stop, Mrs. Patterson suddenly stopped. Oh my goodness, I just realized something, she said. What's that? I'm going to go see my great-grandchild today, and now I have the most amazing story to tell. Can you imagine? I'm going to be able to say I had coffee with Sammy Davis Jr. No one's ever going to believe me. Sammy laughed. Would you like me to sign something for you? Something you can show them as proof? Mrs. Patterson thought for a moment, then pulled a small address book out of her purse. Would you sign this? I keep all my important addresses and phone numbers in here, so I'll always have it with me." Sammy took the little book and wrote, "To Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, one of the kindest souls I've ever met. Thank you for reminding me why the music matters. Your friend, Sammy Davis Jr." As the bus pulled up, Mrs. Patterson gave him a gentle hug. "You take care of yourself, young man, and remember what I told you. What you do matters more than you know." As the bus pulled away with Mrs. Patterson waving from a window seat, Sammy stood on the corner for a few minutes, still processing their conversation. He thought about her husband, a man he'd never met, but who had been changed by his music. He thought about all the other people like them, people whose hearts and minds might be opened by seeing past the surface to the talent and humanity underneath. The rain had stopped, and for the first time that day, Sammy felt hopeful. The meeting at the Opera House had been a disappointment, but this encounter with Mrs. Patterson had reminded him of something more important than any single performance venue. It had reminded him that his work was bigger than just entertainment. It was about building bridges, changing hearts, and proving that talent and character transcended all the artificial barriers people tried to build. When Sammy got home that evening, he called his agent and told him to keep working on the Opera House booking, but also to start looking into other venues for the benefit concert. "I don't care if we have to rent a school gymnasium," he said. "The music needs to be heard, and the message needs to get out there. Today I was reminded that you never know whose heart you might touch, or whose mind you might change." 3 weeks later, Sammy received a letter postmarked from Springfield, Illinois. Inside was a handwritten note from Mrs. Patterson, along with a newspaper clipping announcing the birth of her great-granddaughter. The letter read, "Dear Sammy, I wanted to let you know that little Sarah Elizabeth was born healthy and beautiful. When I told my granddaughter about meeting you, she cried with happiness. She said you've always been her favorite entertainer, and she couldn't believe her grandmother had coffee with you. I also wanted you to know that I've been telling everyone in Springfield about what a gentleman you are, and how kind you were to an old woman who needed help. You're making a difference in more ways than you know. Your friend always, Eleanor Patterson." Sammy kept that letter in his wallet for the rest of his life, pulling it out whenever he needed to remember why his work mattered, and why kindness, both giving it and receiving it, was the most important performance of all. If this incredible story of unexpected kindness, hearts changed through music, and the reminder that we never know whose life we might touch, moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this with anyone who needs to remember that small acts of kindness can have profound impacts, or anyone who's ever wondered if their work really matters. Have you ever had a chance encounter that reminded you of your purpose? Let us know in the comments about the times when a stranger's words changed your perspective. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more amazing true stories about the power of human connection and unexpected friendship.